Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about this little PC right here that is built around the new Radeon RX 7900 GRE graphics card from AMD. And I actually tried to make a decent, affordable, and relatively value-focused system that is all AMD and that will only cost you $1,300 or 1,300 euros, while being powerful enough to game on a 4K resolution or maybe one of those super ultra-wide 49-inch OLED monitors that have been very popular lately. So, if you spent a lot of money on a nice and fancy gaming monitor and now you're trying to put together a system on a slightly tighter budget, this video is for you. Let's begin. And the star of today's video is definitely the RX 7900 GRE Gaming OC from Gigabyte. Now, the GRE was originally launched for the Chinese market in 2023, but then AMD decided to relaunch it globally in 2024, and it is positioned just above the 7800 XT. It has a lot more cores than the 7800 XT, but it does have slower memory by default, which can be fixed with a manual overclock. And since I'm building this system with high-resolution gaming in mind, it is also really nice to see that it comes with 16 gigabytes of memory. For this card, you will have to set aside about $550 in the US or around 600 euros here in the Netherlands. And even though I didn't really have an exact budget in mind when I started planning this video, I figured that $1,250 to $1,300 or euros for the complete build would be a very nice amount to aim for, which is also not super cheap, but considering the current market situation and that it is barely more than what you would have to pay just for the sub-top GPU from NVIDIA, I think it is a very reasonable budget to go for. Unfortunately, that also means that you won't have that much over for a fancy case or a lot of RGB, so I decided to go for the Cooler Master Masterbox Q300L. It is a very simple but well-built and pretty clean-looking micro ATX case that will cost you only $60 or 60 euros, so it will keep the total build cost down, especially when you consider the fact that micro ATX motherboards tend to be some of the cheaper ones on the market. And since I wanted to make an all AMD system, I went for the Ryzen 5 7600X. Now, a 7800X 3D would have been ideal for any gaming build, but it costs a lot more, and for high resolutions, you're mostly going to be GPU bound anyway. So technically, a 7600 non-X or 7500F would be reasonable options as well, but the 7500F is not available in the Netherlands, and the 7600 non-X was only 10 euros cheaper than the X version, so I went for the 7600X. And for this very efficient little processor, you don't need to get a fancy motherboard, so I decided to pick up a Gigabyte B650M D3HP, which is a really simple looking motherboard. It doesn't have any fancy features like built-in I/O shields and RGB, but I only paid about 120 euros for it. And it has 2 M.2 slots for storage, it has 4 memory slots, the VRMs are fine enough and do come with a heatsink, and on the back you get enough of USB ports for your mouse, keyboard, microphone, webcam, and some external storage, plus it has the Type-C and USB 3 headers we need for this case. So in my opinion, it is perfectly good enough for what most people and most builds need. I also decided to go for the Cooler Master Hyper 212 Black CPU cooler since it fits this dark and minimalistic build pretty well. It doesn't cost too much and it will keep the build a lot quieter than a stock cooler would. Now, you can definitely save a bit more money and get something that is even cheaper, but I wanted to spend just a tiny bit more so it fits the case and gives that nice overall look of the whole system. A Ryzen 7600X build does require DDR5 memory, but memory is still pretty cheap, and a nice 32GB DDR5 6000 set will only cost you 100 euros or dollars, which is again a very nice amount to aim for. Now, technically, if you really need to save a bit more, you can go for 16 gigabytes instead, and in most games that will be enough. But some games really benefit quite a bit from having 32 gigabytes of memory. So for $40 more, you will be set a bit better for some future titles as well. And you can say the same thing for storage. So you can save a bit and go for a 1 terabyte SSD and then add another terabyte a bit later. But with games just getting larger and larger, I think 2 terabytes is the minimum you should get for any gaming PC that isn't super limited by your budget. Now, SSD prices change all the time and they vary a lot depending on where you live. So you should always check the prices in your region before deciding which SSD to get. Right now, the WD Blue SN580 is priced really nice, both in the US and in Europe. But I actually managed to buy some KC3000 drives with a nice discount, so I used that one for this build. When it comes to the power supply choice, the GPU with a bit of an overclock will still pull around 300 watts, and you need about 100 to 120 watts for the CPU plus other parts, which puts us in the 400-ish watt range. So I would say a nice 650 watt power supply would be perfect for this build. And you can save a bit and go for a non-modular power supply, but I thought it was just worth spending a little bit more on the cheapest 80 plus gold fully modular power supply because the case is relatively small and it doesn't have a PSU shroud. So I didn't want to have those extra cables that I'm not going to use bundled up in there. And that's it. So this is the final result. And I do think it turned out really well. So it is not too big, it looks nice and clean, and it doesn't really feel like we cut a lot of corners to get here. So the total price is 1,300 euros here in the Netherlands, or about $1,275 in the US. So it fits the budget I had in mind perfectly, but let's see how it performs. Looking at the thermals while gaming, it actually held up really well. And this is with the noise level set to 40 decibels at a 50 centimeter distance, which is to me an acceptable noise level for a system under load. The CPU was at 74 degrees with a 62 watt load. The GPU core set at 68 degrees with a 290 watt load, with the hotspot and memory temps in the low 80s, which is well within spec. The internal case temperature was in mid 40s, which is a bit higher than I usually aim for, but it was also kind of expected since the case only comes with a single outtake fan in the back and it doesn't have that much space on the inside. So I don't think it is too hot, but I would still consider spending another $10 or 10 euros to add a single intake fan instead of running it louder to compensate for the lack of intake. But more importantly, it also games really well. So AMD did fix 7900 GRE overclocking, so I overclocked both the memory and the clock speed a little bit, which made the card almost 10% faster on average than it was in its stock setting. So keep that in mind as overclocking results will vary per card. And looking at some games on 1440p resolution, the results were quite good. Now, I've mostly tested heavier AAA titles as lighter games will obviously run a lot faster, but even games like Avatar, Starfield, or Cyberpunk 2077 will run nicely at high settings. Now, using FSR upscaling on quality setting, there's definitely some interesting results, and in some games we're seeing big FPS gains, so it's definitely worth using FSR. But in other titles, the gains are smaller than I would expect them to be, which points to a CPU bottleneck. So for high FPS 1440p gaming, a faster CPU is something you might want to think about. And since AMD now offers frame generation as well, we can use that to improve the frame rate in some titles as well. Starfield, Remnant 2, and Avatar all feature FSR 3 frame generation, which does increase performance significantly. But whether it's worth doing it or not is a bit of a subjective thing, I would say, because it is not really perfect just yet, and it can show some artifacts here and there, plus it does increase the latency. And I would say in this case, with these 3 games running perfectly fine without any frame generation enabled, I don't really think it's necessary to turn it on, but if you want to, you can always turn it on and just give it a go. Now, looking at 4K resolution without any upscaling, it's a bit too much for the 7900 GRE. Some games will run completely fine, but some of the heaviest titles didn't really hit 60 or some not even 50 FPS on average. But with FSR upscaling set to quality mode, we got 60 plus FPS in all games I've tested for this video, with only Avatar and Starfield ending up just under 70 FPS. And again, you can try to use frame generation to get some of those numbers even higher, which in slower titles like Starfield and Avatar would probably be worth it. But for Remnant 2, for example, which is a bit more latency sensitive, I would say I would keep the frame generation setting off. And if you do have a 49-inch QD OLED monitor like this Aorus CO49DQ, you will also end up with a pretty good experience here, since it has around 90% of the pixels of a 4K monitor. So with upscaling and without frame generation, all the games were running comfortably at over 70 FPS. So I think the overall performance is a bit better than I expected it to be, actually, and it just shows that you really don't have to spend $2,000 to get a good gaming experience. Now, in hindsight, I would have spent another 10 or 20 euros to get an intake fan or two for this build, but other than that, I don't really think I would change that much else. Everything goes together nicely, it is well balanced, it performs really well, and it is nice and quiet, which I definitely appreciate. Now, if your budget was a little bit lower, I would consider the Ryzen 7500F or 7600 Non-X to save a little bit of money, and maybe use a stock cooler instead, but that is as far as I would go before going for a weaker GPU. And if you had a bit more to spend, a 7800 X3D would be the next upgrade in my opinion, especially if you plan to upgrade your GPU in a few years. It will increase the price of the whole PC by about $150 or euros, so that's more than 10%, but it will be worth it if you can stretch your budget that much. Any changes of the case, of the memory or motherboard, for example, would be nice, but they won't offer any actual performance increase. So this is all I had for this video, and now I would really love to hear what you guys think of this build right here, and what would you maybe do differently, because I always really enjoy reading your comments, so don't be shy and leave a comment. And last but definitely not the least, a big thanks to Gigabyte for sponsoring this video and sending over this 7900 GRE so I can make this build to begin with. Anyway, if you like this video and you want to see my future uploads, please do consider clicking that subscribe button down there. Bye guys, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!